Hello, my name is Santiago Gutierrez. I'm Executive Editor of Business Publication Latin Trade. Welcome to day 4 of Latin Trade Week, which is an event in which we have invited some of the world's top experts to reflect and to make sense of the world around business in Latin America, and in particular to shed light on what will happen in the region in 2022. This week has been extremely interesting. On Tuesday, for instance, we had a conversation with the Minister of Finance of Guyana, which, as you might know, is the world's fastest growing economy. On Wednesday, we had a discussion about corporate performance with credit rating agencies and think tanks. Yesterday, think tanks from Washington and London focused on social and political conditions expected in 2022. And today, we want to find opportunities that will open up next year with changes in regulation. So to identify the trends and to decipher their implications, we are very fortunate to have with us 3 fantastic panelists. It is a pleasure to introduce to you Adriana Ibarra Fernandez. Adriana is the principal partner at Baker McKenzie, Mexico. And she's an absolute expert in customs and foreign trade matters. Prior to her engagement with the firm, she was legal director of rules of origin, customs procedures, and safeguards in the Mexican Ministry of Economy, where she participated in the negotiation of several free trade agreements. And by the way, I think she also participated in the first dispute settlement resolution cases initiated by Mexico against the United States under NAFTA. Adriana has been ranked as a leading practitioner by Chambers at Chambers Global and Chambers Latin America, as well as Legal 500 for 10 consecutive years. Then we have Plinio Barbosa. He's the founder and named partner of Barbosa Musnich Aragão BMA in Rio de Janeiro. This company is one of the top business law firms in Brazil. He's a Brazilian lawyer and holds an LLM from the University of Michigan Law School. And his professional practice is primarily in the corporate and infrastructure areas. And he specializes in advising companies and investors in critical moments. He has served as board member in many large public companies in Brazil. And then we have Josvel Ibarra. He's co-managing shareholder of Greenberg Traurig at his Miami office. And previously, he served as co-chair of the firm's Latin American practice. He represented and has represented clients on international corporate transactions, including multinational corporations and prominent Latin American investors on their investments, acquisitions, divestitures, and joint ventures through Latin America and the US. He also advises Latin American family offices on governance and other corporate matters. He has been recognized by leading publications, of course, including Chambers and Partners, and the M&A advisor for more than 20 years. We have many questions for our panelists. For instance, what regulations will change next year? What will be the impact of these changes? How will elections or political pressures or social demands affect the normative environment? So to begin, I will ask each panelist to set the stage for this discussion by making an initial comment on how they see 2022 as far as changes in regulation in Latin America. So let me start with Adriana Ibarra. Adriana.
Thank you, Santiago, and thanks everyone for participating. Well, I'm as Santiago mentioned, a trade lawyer. So that's my focus or the way I start seeing things. And I think that if we look into opportunities for this coming year for Mexico and Latin America, I think nearshoring is going to be a very important one. And that means bringing production closer to home. We saw that started seeing that with the trade war between the US and China that started a few years ago. And it became critical with COVID. So I think that's going to be an important opportunity. Then regarding local measures, I think that there are a few that are going to make companies have to focus more on compliance. I think that's the word of the day. The Mexican administration that took office 3 years ago became more focused on auditing activities. So companies have to focus on that respect. And as part of this intention to increase oversight of the private sector and movement of goods, there's going to be a new bill of lading that will become effective in Mexico next month. And it implies important changes because the bill of lading used to be a commercial document that documented the obligations of the carrier with respect to the goods being transported. And now it's going to be linked to the tax documentation. And any errors in the bill of lading can make the transportation of the goods affected. Products can be seized, and the price paid for the transportation will no longer be deductible. So while I think it's a good idea for the Mexican government to, tackle tax evasion or counterfeit, I think that this is going to represent an affection to all the stakeholders in the international trade chain. So that's an important measure. And the other one that I wanted to mention, and which maybe you have heard in the news, is that Mexico is in the process of implementing an energy reform. And it was presented to the House of Representatives on September 30, and it seeks amending several articles of the Mexican Constitution aimed at regulating the electricity and hydrocarbon industries, nationalize the right to exploration, exploitation, and use of lithium, and establishing that no future concessions will be granted. So it'll require 2/3 of the House of Representatives and the Senate's votes. It's not something that is easy that it'll pass, but if it does, it'll change the electricity and hydrocarbon industries in Mexico in a very considerable manner.
Thank you, Adriana. Let me now turn to Plinio and ask the same question. How do you see the regulation in Brazil in 2022?
Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure, and to speak a little bit about Brazil. Brazil is somehow suffering a lot from a bad image regarding environmental matters, and the way the federal government has dealt with the pandemic, even though nowadays we are one of the countries in the world with the highest level of vaccination. As regards regulations, however, Brazil has evolved tremendously over the last, let's say, 5 years. Several different pieces of law have been enacted, which create improvements as regards foreign investment. It started in 2016, even before the current president was elected, with a law which created what we call an investment partnership program, known in Brazil as PPI, which creates an interaction amongst the public and the private sectors. The PPI every once in a while divulges what are the projects which are expected in the near future. They have a very detailed schedule about for the projects in infrastructure area, including concessions, privatizations, and so on. And that's something to keep an eye on and very important because it allows you to know in advance the opportunities, the stream of opportunities that are coming. Then we had another law in 2019, which updated the system regarding regulatory agencies. It regulated more, it improved and created a certain uniformity across the board as regards the agencies. And that is good because it gives previsibility, you know what to expect, very, very important. Then there was a piece of law in 2019 called the Economic Freedom Law. And that law was extremely important because it strengthened the force of contracts in general. And so it makes it easier for a foreign investment to really rely in the contract when it comes to a concession, to a privatization, and so on. And recently, we had a new government procurement law, which was enacted in 2021. And that law, for example, it allows foreign companies to participate in any federal bid in Brazil. In the past, only local companies would be admitted, but now anyone from anywhere in the world can participate. And there is a provision if someone from abroad wins the bid, there is a provision of time for them to obtain the necessary registrations in Brazil, which makes it very easy. And they also acknowledge, the new law acknowledged the validity of arbitration, of providing for arbitration in contracts regarding public work, regarding concessions, privatizations, and so on. Not only arbitration, but also other forms of dispute resolution, amicable dispute resolutions. And that is something which is very interesting for foreign investors who sometimes are concerned to be subject to a court decision in Brazil. So arbitration is something that is very, very good for them. So, and in addition to that, some specific laws have been passed regulating specific sectors such as natural gas, water and sewage, rail sector, etc. So the environment in Brazil is set, and as we speak today, we will touch on several opportunities that are already scheduled to occur, including today, and the next days to the end of 2021 and for 2022 as well.
Great, thank you so much. Josvel, any comments on next year?
Sure, I think, thank you. And I think that to talk about next year, we have to talk about where we've been in the last year. So the pandemic hit, things really slowed down. And that meant that I think a significant amount of capital was built up in private equity funds. When things opened back up again, or I should say, people realized that business needed to continue, that this wasn't going to be a 1 week or 2 week event. There has been such a deluge of work, particularly in the M&A space, that I have not seen this level of work and valuations and activity probably since the late 1990s, when all you had to do to raise $100 million was put .com after your name. It has really been another tech boom, and I hope that we don't end like that one ended up. The other thing that I think is important to talk about is the amount of capital flight that there has been from Latin America into the US. And, you know, I sit in Miami, and there's no better example of that than Miami. I mean, Miami has, I should say that there's also a lot of capital flight from New York and California to Miami because of tax laws that have been implemented in the United States. But if you haven't been to Miami recently, you will see that it's just an amazing boom that is happening from investors all over the region. Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, mostly Central America, and mostly driven by uncertainty that's happening there, combined with the inflow of sort of renewed push in Miami. And frankly, Miami is very close to Latin America, so I think that there's an even greater spotlight on investment opportunities there. I think that what SoftBank has done by focusing investment in the region, back in 2019, has also, spurred that on. Talking about funds and how they drive the marketplace, I think that a lot of important economic groups in Latin America are themselves thinking about, hey, rather than invest in a fund, why don't we look at putting together our own fund? So you have seen an incredible boom in the fund formation practice that we have. And even when families or important economic groups are not participating directly as a general partner of these funds, they're sometimes being the anchor LP for funds, and then taking a piece of the GP vehicle as well, which is really an interesting change in dynamic in the way that capital is being raised and deployed in the region. And lastly, I just to make a point, I recently learned that regulation, or what my law school calls now the regulatory state, has become so large and influential in everything that is done that my law school, where I went, NYU Law School, has now said that you no longer have to take constitutional law during your first year in law school. It has been replaced by a class called the regulatory state, because it has been such important. I think many of us would argue that given the things that have happened in the United States recently, maybe they should put constitutional law back into the curriculum, as is a very important thing to touch on. But I think that is driven by things like, foreign investment in the U.S. has become extremely complicated. We could have a whole separate discussion on CFIUS, which is the federal government agency that looks at foreign investment into the United States. And whereas before I would worry about that only if you were buying a missile plant or a nuclear plant, that has really expanded to things as benign as the purchase of real estate. Is that real estate located near a sensitive location? The U.S. has always dealt with sanctions on places like Cuba, but now the sanctions have expanded to Venezuela and Nicaragua on sort of very complicated regimes that affect investment really throughout the region. If you're a Panamanian company looking to do a loan agreement, you best be careful if you're planning to raise capital internationally that you don't cross these rubrics. And then finally, I would just say that the infrastructure bill is going to bring a lot of opportunities in the coming year. There was a big push for public-private partnerships here in the 2006, 2007. I think foreign companies came to the U.S. and realized that we're not one country, we're 50 different countries, and that there's a big difference between California and Texas. So hopefully a little bit more federal oversight through the infrastructure bill will help drive those projects.
Josbel, thank you so much. That's so interesting. And let me go back to Adriana. And I wanted to ask you something about US-Mexico or North American trade. Do you see any changes next year, any regulatory changes next year that will open up opportunities for investors?
Yes, Santiago. As I briefly mentioned, the U.S.-China trade war, even with the change in administration from Trump to President Biden, as we all know, he left those measures in place. So that continues to be a concern for companies operating in the U.S. So I think that free trade agreements are still going to be very useful, but focusing on the USMCA, it's a new agreement which has been in place only for 1 year and a half now. And there are still many opportunities that can be taken from the agreement. It includes provisions that have more of a social view, including provisions on environment and labor, and others that were just parallel agreements in the case of NAFTA. I think that there are other agreements that are reshaping and which may represent an opportunity and a challenge for North America, such as the CPTPP. That was an agreement aimed precisely at competing or tackling the increase in trade by China. But when the US decided not to participate in the agreement and the other 11 countries decided to move forward, then there have been newcomers that are interested in participating. That's the case of the UK, which formally requested to become a party to the CPTPP. Thailand has expressed interest. Taiwan has formally requested to participate, and China raised its hand when the US decided not to become a party, and even when the initial purpose was to compete with China. Now China in September formally requested to become a party to this agreement. And this is going to be interesting because in the USMCA, there's a provision that indicates that if a party to the USMCA wishes to start negotiations for a free trade agreement with a non-market economy, it has to give notice to the other two parties, and the other two parties can decide to change the agreement for a bilateral agreement between the other two. Now, the issue here is that both Canada and Mexico are parties to the CPTPP. So if China is successful in becoming a party to the CPTPP, then the US would simply need to withdraw from the USMCA. I don't see that as a very high likelihood that China will become a party because CPTPP contains very strict provisions on ESG matters and others. But we will see. We will see. It's going to be a very, very interesting year.
Absolutely. Plinio, as you mentioned, the regulations on private investment in infrastructure have changed quite a bit in the past 10 years in Brazil. Will there be any additional transformations in 2022? And perhaps the second question is in terms of investment opportunities, what projects, ongoing or upcoming projects would you highlight?
Sure. As I mentioned, most of the regulatory changes have already been implemented. And going forward, we might have changes in specific areas. For example, it's a trend that has been revealed by the government. When a specific sector is up for concession or privatization, then they try, it's a provision contained in the PPI, the program for partnership in investments that was introduced, that they make a public hearing in order to discuss with the sector what could help the sector and what changes would be required. So I would say that going forward, there would be mainly changes in specific areas, but they used to be normally changes that remove barriers, that remove difficulties which the players of the sector identify. There's maybe one sector which is still behind, which where some changes in the regulatory environment would be welcome, which is the foreign investment in rural land in Brazil, which is today is extremely limited. And there are some bills before Congress trying to overturn that and to open up the sector to foreign investment as well. That is something which could happen in 2022. As regards investment opportunities, there is a myriad of projects going on right now. As we speak today, there are 5 ports in Brazil which are subject to an auction today. So 5 ports just today. Next week, there will be a toll road, which will also be up for a concession bid. In December, we have some very important water and sewage concessions that will be put to an auction. One area in the state of Rio de Janeiro and 2 other areas in the state of Alagoas. So this is still 2021. When we move to 2022, and there will be the 7th round of concession of airports. And that will involve 25 airports throughout the country, including 2 of the most important airports in Brazil, which are the downtown airports of the city of São Paulo and of the city of Rio de Janeiro. And those are amongst the airports that will be considered during 2022. In addition to that, there are 9 toll roads which will be put up to a concession bid. Most of those roads they have already been considered in the past, 30 years ago, and this is a renewal. Last week or 2 weeks ago, the most important toll road in Brazil, which is the road that connects São Paulo to Rio de Janeiro, was re-licitated after 30 years of concession, and that is already accomplished. In 2022, we have 9 other roads that will be up to concession. In addition to that, we have, for example, 18 ports throughout the country, which will be subject to different auctions. 3 of those ports are in the port within the area, the major area of the Port of Santos in São Paulo, which is by far the largest port in Brazil. And also 2 are allocated to terminals, which will be put to an auction, allocated in the port of Rio de Janeiro. Then there is a very important privatization, which is relates to Eletrobras. Eletrobras is traditionally the power company of the government. It used to control all of the units that generate power in Brazil. Some have already been transferred to the private initiative. And in 2022, there will be the privatization of Eletrobras. The idea is to do it through a follow-on of shares. And so the government that holds today, Eletrobras is already a public company, but the government controls about 70% of the capital stock. And there will be a huge follow-on, which in the amount sufficient to dilute the participation of the government down to at the most 45%. So the government will probably still be the major shareholder of the company, but the company would be entirely regulated by private, would be a company of the private sector, would no longer be subject to rules of government procurement and legislation related to the public sector. So that's something important. And the proceeds of the sale of the shares will be entirely used in new power generation facilities and projects throughout the country. So that's something very important from the point of view of the Eletrobras and from the point of view of the new generation projects that will occur. And there are also several other companies being privatized. One important one is the mail company, the public mail company, which will be privatized in 2022. It is probably the only company which is present in each and every municipality throughout Brazil. So it has a value, which is because of the location, which goes well beyond the mere activity of mail. So it's a strategic company which will be privatized. And that is only at the federal level. If you go down to the states, there are also several other privatization and concessions going on. For example, the organized port of Santos, São Paulo, and will be up as well to a concession. There are several areas of concessions involving water and sewage, which is, according to Brazilian constitution, the power to concede those initiatives belong to the municipality or to the state. It is not federal. And because of the new law that was enacted, they are now going to be put to concession. And there are initiatives throughout the country. So 2022 is a very interesting year. It will be an election year. We have a general election at the end of the year. And so probably most of what I've mentioned here will occur early in the year, in the first semester, probably. And so we will see a lot of activity.
Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting year for Brazil next year.
Sure.
Let me ask you as well. You mentioned funds. You mentioned real estate investment. Do you see any other specific opportunities for sectors that are going to open up in 2022? Perhaps in the States, or from your vantage point in Miami, in the Latin American region?
Sure. I mean, we're seeing, and I think Adriana touched on this, and it's the whole phenomena of nearshoring. I think that as like I told someone, I was like, we're probably not going to be doing a lot of looking at long-term issues with China when they're planning how to blow up U.S. aircraft carriers, which just come out in the news. I'm sure we do it too, but there has really driven, and I think some of the points that Adriana mentioned about the provisions in the free trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, that's really driving companies to look at places like Mexico. But I think also Central America, I think is becoming key. By the way, I think that some of the labor changes in Mexico are also driving companies to look elsewhere in Latin America. Particularly, I would say, companies that do, labor related heavy businesses, looking at places like Costa Rica, for example, or Panama or Colombia for investment. I can tell you that we worked on a couple of important transactions in those sectors from European companies looking to Central America, for example, as opposed to looking to India and other places. I would also say that the entire fintech sector is on fire. Everyone's looking for the opportunities to, through technology, gather access to the millions and millions of people in Latin America who are not participants in the traditional banking sector. I had an interesting conversation the other day with someone based here in Miami, an entrepreneur who's basically doing like a cloud-based banking, primarily targeted for Latin America. And then I think that the sort of the old staples that always happen in Latin America, right? Consumer products.
I think we have a problem with Josvel's connection. Let me see if we can just wait a little bit and see if he comes back. No, I think we lost him. Okay, so let me
connect. He will reconnect for sure.
I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah, he told us right before this transmission that he's in Ecuador right now and in a hotel room. So it's, I mean, that happens. So let me turn to taxes. Taxes, of course, are key drivers of investment. Oh, there he is. I think he's back. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, let's.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. I think I highlighted the sectors, Santiago. Sorry about that.
No, that's perfectly okay. So if you want to finish, please go ahead.
I don't know where it cut off, I think, but I said fintech, and I think the just traditional sectors like consumer products and your big companies buying up market share, and we've seen that sort of across the region as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So we were talking about taxes. Taxes, of course, are key drivers of investment and international allocation of capital. And the common theme is that taxes will probably change all over the region as the coffers of all nations were emptied out by the demands from the pandemic. So let me ask Adriana, in Mexico, things are happening. A portion of a recent tax reform will be set in action in January 1st, and then new changes will come in 2022, as I understand. So my question is, how dramatic are those changes? Do you foresee any major problems, any opportunities?
Well, it's interesting to see that it's called a tax reform, and of course there are some changes, but there are no new taxes or no new deductions or no reductions to income tax. But what it provides is new tools for the tax authorities to inspect easier and faster with measures such as restricting digital seals, which are like the electronic signatures that you need to process invoices, process import entries, and in general terms, operate. And these digital seals can be restricted even when one of your suppliers is in a list of companies doing inexistent transactions or simulated transactions. So because the tax authorities are passing the administrative burden on the private sector, I think it's going to be very important for companies to pass that burden to suppliers. And this can be done contractually. So it's important to set obligations of suppliers in contracts to avoid that any wrongdoing by suppliers can hinder your operations, no? So I think that the main issue of the tax reform is compliance, because as I said earlier, Mexico is increasing auditing activities in all sectors. So I think that's the most relevant thing that we can see from the tax reform. There is going to be a change for maquiladora companies, which are companies that import into Mexico materials on a temporary basis, process, and then export finished goods. And that's a very important sector of the manufacturing operation in Mexico. And there's a change there where they will no longer be able to determine the compensation or the consideration for the manufacturing activities through an advanced pricing agreement. So that's going to represent changes for maquiladoras. And there are other changes in transfer pricing matters that are more specific. But I think that the message is there are no new taxes, but there's going to be more oversight or more, auditing activity by the authority, and companies need to focus really strictly on compliance.
Thank you. Plinio, tax reform has been under discussion for quite some time in Brazil. So my question is, in practical terms, what changes will we see in 2022? Do you think that cooperation among international tax authorities will increase next year? Will that affect investment decisions?
Yeah, actually, there was a very important, very comprehensive project, a proposal, a bill involving a tax reform, which was submitted to Congress by the executive branch, by the Ministry of Finance. And it was approved with some changes in one of the houses, in the House of Parliament, but it needs to be approved as well at the Senate level, by the Senate. And nowadays, the expectation is that it will be extremely difficult to have the reform approved still in 2021, which would be essential for the new rules to apply in 2022. And so there won't be, we do not expect many changes from a tax point of view. But anyhow, it's still possible. No one can say for sure that the Senate will not approve the transaction before the bill before the end of the year. So it's important to keep an eye on what changes are being made. And generally, also there is no creation of new taxes, but there is a change in the taxes. They affect very much individuals in Brazil, like Brazilian investors in company. Today, for example, dividends are not taxed. And so they would introduce a withholding tax on dividends as well. There are possibilities to defer the payment of taxes for individuals by investing in offshore companies. And the individuals only pay the tax once they get the money back. Otherwise, the tax is postponed forever. And that would probably come to an end. Also, if you create an exclusive fund, a fund for your own use in Brazil, you can also get a deferral of taxes for a very long period of time. And all of that was targeted by the reform. And the idea was to force profits to be taxed as they are made, at least annually. By the end of each year, they would be taxed. And on the other side, there would be a reduction on the corporate tax, which is levied in Brazil. Today, Brazil has a corporate tax, which is higher than the tax, for example, which is levied in the US. And that creates a problem for companies that have subsidiaries in the country. Sometimes they are not able to use all of the taxes they paid in Brazil in the US, because there is a limitation. Maybe Yosbel can touch on that aspect as well. And that would be corrected by the reform. They would reduce, as I said, the corporate tax. It would be aligned with tax in the US and in most of the other countries. and they would increase the taxation for individuals. For foreign investors, the main change would be also the tax on dividends, which today dividends are not taxed. It doesn't matter where you invest from. It can be from a regular country. It can be from a tax haven. Dividends are not taxed. And so they would start, but that's something very peculiar. There are only a couple of countries in the whole world that do not tax dividends, right? And so it's a move which would be a move to become more aligned with all of the other countries too. It would not be something completely wrong or completely different, and so on. So my impression is that the tax reform that is being discussed, even if it is approved in time to be in effect in the beginning of 2022, would not have a huge impact on investment decisions, maybe only for companies that are deciding where to locate a new production center, and which could not choose Brazil because of the higher corporate tax in Brazil. But for individuals, for people interested in the financial market and in a stock exchange and so on, there wouldn't be very significant changes.
Thank you, Plinio. Yosel, and what have you seen as far as capital movements, investor appetite changing and shifting from country to country, from or at least driven by tax changes?
Sure. I'm glad that Plinio asked me to comment on Brazil tax, but honestly, of all the countries in Latin America, and I think Plinio would agree with me that it is very difficult sometimes to structure things with Brazil. And as I think back on what transactions have not gone through because of just insurmountable tax issues, the only one that I can think of is one where a Brazilian company was involved, and there was just no way to bridge a gap over something. I think that there's a greater equalization of tax regimes. The days of bearer shares and wholly territorial taxation systems, which still exist in some countries, are really going away. And when the United States has a corporate tax rate at 21%, and even if the reforms that are being talked about, they're talking about maybe 26, 28%, that's still very competitive. It creates really an incentive for tax to stop distorting where to make those investments. I think that anything that drives uncertainty, including in the tax regime, is helping to drive business to places where maybe things are a little bit more predictable. I see, for example, a lot of LATAM companies moving to places like the UK as their headquarter, because the UK has a very beneficial tax regime. It's also a jurisdiction where there's a great degree of flexibility and how to structure the operations of companies, unlike some other traditional places where it's not in English or Spanish or Portuguese. It's a different language that controls them. I would say that if I had to pick like one thing that I hope governments would address, is that sometimes the regulation of tax addresses is trying to address an issue and doesn't address it quite in the way that is intended. And I'm thinking specifically about indirect capital gains taxes that are applied, particularly in places like in Colombia and Mexico. And regulators in those countries are trying to capture sales of subsidiaries in those countries, but there's so much uncertainty sometimes in the processes that's done that it really has become a primary issue on Latin American M&A deals across the region.
Thank you, Josel. And let me, I think this is going to be the final question for all of you. Adriana, investors and banks will probably force the adoption of stricter ESG standards all over the world. In non-financial companies, that's going to be the norm in a sense. Of course, there has been a lot of talk about how these standards will limit exports from Latin America, say, to Europe under the Green Deal. But going in the other direction, in the positive prospect direction, do you see any advantage for Mexican or any other Latin American companies under the new, say, greener set of regulation?
Well, I mean, ESG regulations are positive because they create a healthier environment, which is suitable for investment. And being norms aimed at improving environment and ethics and anti-corruption, I mean, tackling ethics and anti-corruption issues by companies, it was necessary for Mexico and other Latin American countries to adopt those measures if they want to remain competitive. We were way behind in these areas. And I think that Mexico started making changes with the labor reform that Josbo was mentioning. And of course, investors can look into other countries. But if we all adopt an ESG view, then that should not represent a disadvantage for a country to adopt measures to guarantee labor rights, for example. No, the USMCA contains provisions on environment and on labor, which are not parallel agreements, as I was mentioning. And the implication of that is that now, in the event of breach to these provisions, the other countries can bring Mexico into a panel, into a dispute settlement panel, as the ones where I participated, for breach to these provisions. So I think it's a tendency. I think that I'm not sure it's going to represent an advantage for Latin American companies. It's a challenge. But it needs to happen, and I think it's very positive. Now, the Mexican energy reform, I think it may affect compliance by Mexico of ESG commitments. One point foreseen in the bill is that the state is in charge of the energy transition, using all energy sources available to the state, and it says something like in a sustainable manner. But there's, rumor that Mexico will comply with the generation of and supply of electricity using non-renewable resources, fossil fuel, carbon-based, and the bill also eliminates clean energy certificates. So that's absolutely contradictory with all these ESG view worldwide. So that's what I can see from the Mexican standpoint. It doesn't represent like an advantage. I think it's more of a challenge, and but I think that all countries now are under a very clear view from the international perspective. So any measures such as if the bill passes as it was proposed for the energy reform, will have a very negative impact on the view of Mexico from the international perspective.
Thank you, Adriana. Let me stay on the ESG track, and let me ask you as well, do you expect any major changes in laws or norms due to stricter ESG standards?
Oh, unfortunately, no. I mean, from the Mexican standpoint, I didn't hear if you were aimed at Josbo. Sorry, the two Ibarras.
No worries.
No worry, cousin. We're good. She's actually not my cousin. One of the themes that I've talked about here is how private equity is driving so much of, particularly on the M&A market, right? But that also drives how companies behave because, if you're looking to do an exit transaction down the road at some point. And if you look at the website of any big PE fund, right? Any, think about the biggest ones that you can think out there. And they will all have an ESG side. Some of them have ESG officers that track this. And that is because the pension funds and insurance companies and other entities that fund those PE funds are themselves very focused on that. So that, I think, when we talk about regulation and what came first, the regulatory state, as I mentioned, or private enterprise being driven by these principles, I think that there's a coalescing of those two forces now to really drive that. If you're operating any business in Latin America or wherever, and you're thinking down the road of, and maybe not even a sale transaction, but some sort of equity investment or what have you, you have to know that you're going to be put under the ESG spotlight, and that if you haven't addressed those issues beforehand, just like compliance was a very big deal. I always tell people the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was passed in the 1970s, but it didn't really sort of come into real effect until probably the 2000s. And I think that ESG is going to drive those changes as well.
Thank you so much. And let me finish this this conversation, asking Plinio something about elections in Brazil. You have elections in 2022. Do you think that they could affect investments going forward, or even the project's timeline?
And the answer is no. I don't see how it could affect foreign investments in Brazil. Brazil has a very long and well-established tradition of being a friendly jurisdiction for foreign investment and for privatization, for concession. And even during the recent period when Brazil was governed by the leftist party, which is the Labour Party of President Lula, and afterwards of President Dilma Rousseff, there was no setback on the opening of the economy to foreign investment. And during that period, the government reduced the base as regards privatization, selling companies, but changed the focus to concessions, to conceding public services. And both are sides of the same coin. And we needed both of them. And so there has never been a significant discussion on any privatization or concession of public companies. So we don't see it as a problem, as something that will be affected by the election. Maybe on the months before the election, one candidate or other candidate might use the argument for election purposes. But truly, we expect the trend to continue to be in favor of foreign investments, in favor of privatization, and of concession of public services. That's our expectation here.
Plinio, thank you so much. I think that's a very good way to end this conversation. So I want to thank our panelists, Adriana, Plinio, Joswell. We learned a lot from you today. Special thanks to the Latin Trade Events team headed by Tatiana, Lorena, Fernando, Maria Julia, and a special thanks to you in the audience. Please join us in a discussion on international trade that follows immediately after this session. So have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.